All right, the next storyline that I'm going to be tracking when the Ducks return to spring practice is building out depth in the front seven. Let's start with the defensive line because this is a group that is absolutely loaded. I think one of the most exciting storylines around this defensive line group for Oregon, for Dan Lanning, Tony Tuioti, and the rest of the coaching staff is Popo Amavai is back for one more season. This is a guy who was an all-conference selection before he got injured, missed all of last year. So he's going to have to be knocking off some rust here in the spring. But he's one of the best defensive linemen that that Oregon has right now. He's someone that I think can really do a good job of manning down that interior of the defensive line for Oregon. And you can't forget about the other guys that they have in that room, some big-time talent coming back from a year ago. Brandon Dorlus is obviously the big guy in that discussion. I think with the depth that Oregon has on the defensive line, that's going to allow Brandon Dorlus to move around. And really, I think for Oregon to put him in the best spot to be successful because he's a super athletic guy, definitely got a high motor, and he's one of the most gifted defensive linemen that the Ducks have on their roster right now. Then we talked about Casey Rogers, who was a massive success after transferring over from Nebraska following Tony Tuioti, as well as Jordan Riley, who came over from Nebraska last year. The Ducks don't have Jordan Riley anymore. He's the lone departure from last year's group. But this is a really veteran group and a pretty productive group too. Who else do you have? You have Keon Ware-Hudson. You have Sam Taimani on that defensive line as well. We can talk about the defensive ends or the edge rushers. It's kind of a different group, but we'll talk about them in just a moment. I think Keon Ware-Hudson is probably poised to take another step. I think he's kind of flown under the radar, but had some pretty good play during his time at Oregon, has battled a couple of injuries, which make it hard to stay on the field, obviously. But this is one of the most experienced groups that the Ducks have, and probably one of the deepest groups that the Ducks have as it stands right now in spring football. It's so important to return production and return experience along the lines of scrimmage. And that's something that Oregon has that not every team in the country has. So it's definitely something fortunate for them. Also talking about scheme continuity carrying over from last year, I think that's an added bonus as well. So this group is super experienced on the interior, and then you signed a number of really talented defensive linemen as well. You look at Tavita Pomee, Amari Washington, Michael Gardner, all those guys, and a couple more names that I probably forgot to mention. But maybe you can have a really experienced group, and then to have a bunch of guys coming in from the high school ranks to learn behind them is really, really good. And I think that that's kind of the position that Oregon wants to find themselves in now and moving forward. Just because you have a really good first group or a really good position group with some vets, you want to bring some guys in that can learn behind them and then build towards the future. I think that's always what college football is doing. You got to focus on the here and now, but you got to juggle that at the same time and look into the future as well. So depth in the front seven is definitely strong. We started off talking about the defensive line. Now let's push it out a little bit more to talk about the defensive ends and the edge rushers. The edge rushers are a really interesting group right now because I think that Oregon doesn't have as many proven options as they probably want from a year ago, right? You lose DJ Johnson from last season, and then Mace Funa comes back. He looks like he's really kind of maybe taking the next step in his game. I think he's been at Oregon for a while, so some fans were hoping to see what we saw from Funa last season. His biggest play probably was that pick six against Wazoo that ultimately helped Oregon win the game. And I think that was a huge game because it showed us that Oregon is capable of being a team that can put together a comeback, something that we haven't seen in recent years, certainly under Mario Cristobal with that ground and pound offense. So yeah, I think Mace Funa is kind of, one of the best returner that they have, but we got to talk about Jordan Birch. Jordan Birch, big time addition from the transfer portal coming over from South Carolina. You're really looking at Tosh Lapoy and Dan Lanning to help take his game to the next level. I think that he's such a good addition because I already talked about all those guys that you have on the D line. Brandon Dorlus being one of them, Casey Rogers. Jordan Birch, I think, can really help Oregon have, a bunch of different options along that defensive line. all the best defenses in college football, they don't have just one solid defensive lineman. They have multiple guys across the board, across that defensive line that can knock back the offensive line, stop the run, and then most importantly, get after the quarterback. That is obviously the area that Oregon's defense has been lacking in the most over these past couple years, and that's an area for growth here in spring football. So I think Jordan Burch obviously gives Oregon a very, very high ceiling guy. High floor too, I'd say, coming over from the SEC, right? But that was a massive recruiting win for the Ducks in this offseason, adding some experience and some decent production as well from his previous stop at South Carolina. But looking behind them, or looking ahead of them rather, what does the depth look like at edge rusher, outside linebacker for Oregon? I think it's a little bit uncertain right now. You have Mateo Uiagalelei, who enrolled early at Oregon as one of the headliners in that class. Big early signing day commitment for the Ducks. And you see the pictures of Mateo. I mean, he's supposed to be a senior in high school right now, and he looks like he's fitting in there, at least physically, with some of these big defensive linemen on Oregon's roster. He's 6'5", 250 around there. So I know fans are really excited to see what he can do. And I think guys like him, guys like Tatum Tuioti, Blake Purchase, Jaden Moore, also an early enrollee on campus. Blake Purchase is not enrolled yet, but he's a big-time guy to keep an eye on because this lack of depth, for an edge rusher, for outside linebacker, it could put Oregon in the position where they need some of these younger guys to contribute. So I think that's kind of exciting. Maybe a little bit not quite the position you want to be in, but I think that there's a couple of guys. Ashton Porter is another really talented guy, Under Armour All-American in the 2023 recruiting class that the Ducks got out of Texas. He's another guy that could find his way into that two deep right now. I think another guy I wanted to mention, maybe not so much on the outside because I think they've kicked him inside a little bit, is Jake Shipley. I think he's starting to look like he's progressing more at Oregon, and he's kind of seeing the field a little bit more. But you got some pretty solid options along the outside linebacker. It's just in terms of, it's a question of, can these guys develop? Can they take that next step to ultimately see the field in 2023? So you got some good options there. You have your mainstays with Funa and Birch as well. But I think you kind of maybe find yourself looking for some more depth after you look at those guys. So I think Oregon's got some really solid depth along the interior. And, you're kind of looking for some more answers, looking for some more dudes as you, kind of look on the outside of that front seven. And it's going to be a major storyline to track here in spring football.